Bear with us. Let me call tech support. She should be right down.
It was working when I didn't want it. My name is Mourad. I used the name Cardijn because I thought I was important to Joe. So, can I talk into the mic? I'm sorry. So I go by Joe or Cardijn. And I'm going to talk about CJudge Act as conversation, in conversation, and the review of life as a lifelong spiritual developmental journey. So, we all have a story about how we became involved in the movement. My story is pretty simple. I just married into it. So instead of just getting a spouse, Teresa there, spouse of over 25, it's 26 years. I got a whole bunch of friends, colleagues involved in the movement. And what I noticed, there was a commonality in their experiences, in their life journey. Something that, although I had experience with that kind of formation, that kind of, say, ministry, campus ministry, and so on, I didn't see it as much as I did. I didn't see some key features that I did in the movement. And that was when, as Bob mentioned, when I was teaching at the National University of Singapore, where the movement was still strong. And as Paul already pointed out, by the time I went to school, in college, there was no more YCS. There was no more Cardijn church. So that my introduction to it was in going to Singapore first. It's coming, right? Oh, that's coming. That's my computer. That's coming.
I saw it.
It was just there. It was just there.
Oh. Okay, so it's the title of my talk. So, what I noticed is, although I was familiar with Catholic social action, faith formation, catechism, theology, the connection between those three was not something that I had seen implemented in my religious formation. And so in particular, the interaction between CJudge Act, even having those in the same sphere, just being mentioned in the same sentence is significant. But in addition, I noticed that it's part of a lifelong journey. So it's not CJudge Act, it's CJudge Act, CJudge Act. It feeds on itself. Actions at one level that are interpreted in light of actions at another level in an earlier time. Amongst different members of the community, there's a comparison, and there's a growth, and there's a personal formation. And that was very important. I noticed that there was a personal formation that stays with people throughout their lives. So even when we met friends that were no longer church, that were no longer practicing faith, they still had that consciousness that was brought forth by this method in the interaction that we see. And so, trying to account for it, amateurishly looking at it as a sociologist, I wanted to understand this a little better. And so what I hit upon, talking to Teresa, she seemed to have this remarkable fluency with religious ideas, spiritual ideas. When I discovered something, I'd pass it by her, and she'd say, I learned about that when I was in 8th grade in my class. I could never get that past me. So there's something very significant going on. So this is a linguist, Noam Chomsky, and he's famous for his theories about our innate ability to learn language at an early age. And so I looked at, well, I was familiar with some of these ideas, and I noticed there were connections between what was going on formatively in the movement and what Chomsky talked about. And these are three key ideas from Noam Chomsky. And if you go to his latest talk, he still talks about it. Of course, he's been doing this for 60 years over, so ideas have developed and changed. But these are three key constants, and there are probably more. And the first one is the distinctiveness of language. It's something that makes us quintessentially human. Other animals, like migratory birds, are able to represent the world around them. They have an internal GPS system. They can do that very well. And like parrots, they can mimic language. They can perform linguistic acts. But putting them together, integrated in a certain way, is something that only comes about in the human sphere. The second thing is the universality of grammar. If you take people from varied cultures, different times, you find that the development of language pretty much follows the same pattern. And it doesn't matter if you're born in halfway around the world, and as a child you're brought up in the United States, you develop your fluency just like everybody else. And what I noticed, to talk about the movement again, what I noticed is that, and quite recently, when Teresa met other members of the movement that had practiced it all over the world and at different times, immediately they were like they were old friends. Never having part of it. They immediately understood what the movement was about and what it was to be sort of formed within the movement. So there's that aspect of universality there too. And the last thing, which I want to kind of talk about a little bit, is there is an infinite quality to this competency. In other words, you don't acquire the language sort of in bits and pieces as you get more and more input. Now you get a certain amount of input and suddenly you're able to produce an infinite number of grammatical sentences. Theoretically, obviously, the ability after a certain while, time and space considerations, that's right. And so this has to happen. You can't approximate that. Something has to gel, something has to occur. There has to be some kind of culmination to the process. And that's what I would like to look at today. And by use of a notion of an infinitary notion, use of the notion of the infinite. And the infinite, we can think about not just as sort of that which cannot be reached, that which is outside of us and never enters in, but we can approximate it. But as a way of giving us enough room to model things where the finite is unable to model. And this is seen in various modern notions of the infinite, where there's not just one infinite, there's many infinite. In fact, George Cantor, the originator of the modern notion of the infinite, called them transfinite. So it's not quite the end of infinity, but it's still not finite. And so there's a whole world, literally the more you have, the more you can think of. A never-ending source of what we would think of as infinite, what he called transfinite. However, it was still difficult to access, still something that, as humans, there was still a challenge to be able to capture. So along comes in the next century, Alan Turing, who is, if you've heard of him, considered the father, the progenitor of our modern theory of computing. And what he did, he made the infinite accessible through computer algorithms. So if you have a computer, one thing you notice is it's not a good thing. So a lot of this may not be good. Is that when you have a problem, you have a bug, the thing hangs. And potentially, it can go on forever doing nothing. or doing something that you don't want it to do. That's a bug, but it's also a feature of the system. It allows us to access these infinite structures. And I've got two pictures of Alan Turing here. One is sort of the concrete version, the kind of hardware version, and then there's the kind of software version. So I think of it as this is the enfleshment of Alan Turing, the enfleshment of the infinite into the finite world. So I see it as kind of an incarnational idea. And one of the applications of Turing's thesis is made by this man, Raymond Smullyan. You may have heard of him from books such as What is the Name of This Book? Or books of logic, about truth tellers and liars on an island, and who you believe, and what can you conclude. But one of the famous results that he has, although it's not that very, there aren't that many applications, but I found a way to apply it, in this case, that I found very interesting, is what's called the double recursion theorem. And if you would indulge me, this is the only math that I'm going to talk about. And the good thing about it is that you can forget about, I'll show you a picture, and you can forget about the math in just a minute. What's that? Oh yeah, I will. I'm going to explain it. Don't worry, I'm not going to let you go that easy. So what it says is that for any F and G are computable procedures, algorithms, computer programs, there exists A and B, which are computable objects, such that you apply the procedure to A, you get B, you apply a procedure to B, you get back A. You can think of it as the simultaneous closure, the simultaneous culmination of both F and G. It's what they both aspire to, what they both become. And one way we can apply it is if we think of F as a relational structure, to use a very simple example, where you have a string which is like a sentence, something that somebody can say, and then you can relate it to he or she. So you can say he and then something, and then she and something. And performative is to take he and something and to say he said blah, 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 she said blah, blah, blah. If you look at the application of the double recursion theorem, what you get are two things. One, an infinite set of grammatical sentences. It's kind of a trivial case, but it's easy to understand. He said, she said, he said, she said. You iterate that, you get an infinite number of sentences. And you also get an infinite relational system that relates he and she and the things that they can say. So it gives you exactly what Chomsky, an example of what Chomsky discovered, this infinite ability to generate grammatical sentences. And this is a way to picture it. Okay, so if I want you to remember anything about my talk, is picture like this. So think of the red and the blue, the red and the blue, the red and the blue, as framing of what comes before it. So you can put a blue frame around it, and you frame what was previously. And think of it as going on infinitely. It's basically what you see. If you've ever been to the barber and there are two mirrors, think of one red mirror and one blue mirror. You look one way, and you see this. You look the other direction, and you'll see this. And so this captures this A and B thing. They're infinite structures that complement each other, that instantiate the culmination of these processes. So thinking about this in terms of acquisition of language also applies to further things that as you grow, as you develop. If you think of the red and the blue as alternatively giving you a framing of the prior thing, then the structures that you get, those two diagrams, you think of as a kind of symbiotic equilibrium, is what I call it. They work together, and they're stable. Apply the blue to the red, and you get the blue, and apply the red to the blue, you get the red. So framing one gives you the other, and framing the other. And the way to think about it in terms of C. Judge Act is that The red could be the representation, the seeing and the judging part. And the blue is the action. And so what I notice in terms of the movement is that there is a way of looking at see, judge, act, not just in isolation, but see, judge, act as a process, whereby an action contains within it an potentially infinite number of judgments of prior insight, of reflection. And similarly with reflection, there's prior action that is reflected by it. And I mentioned this to the presenters of the workshop, and they gave me an example of painting a church. Right? You can start see, judge, act from an observation, judgment, or you can start from action. Painting a church, you can ask, well, why are we painting the church? Who's painting the church? For what purpose are we painting the church? And what that does is it gives rise to a process, a whole series of questions that give a sense of the whole, that converges on an idea or a way of responding. So this is the idea of the symbiotic equilibrium as applied to the see, judge, act method. So I see that developmentally, what wasn't happening, say, in the human centers, where these things were not integrated together, is happening in the see, judge, act method because of this equilibrium, of this convergence, just like the linguistic competence comes into play. And so you develop a kind of spiritual competence, a spiritual fluency. And so digging on the parallels, as I mentioned, so it combines the representation of the formative, it's an emergent novel phenomena, and infinite diagram patches. And the interesting thing is that what happens is you have a broadened state of consciousness. The equilibrium state, because it involves something outside of you. It's not just different parts of yourself, but it involves interpersonal, political in terms of the actions, in terms of the discussions, in terms of the issues. And you deal with things as they are. So you don't have to be, it's not like you have to be something in order to do something, or you have to put yourself in a certain state so that you have the right beliefs. So you start with where you are and you just develop the ideas. You develop yourself. And involve even into the political, where we're connected to the social, economic, and biological environment, so that it has potentially a very broad scope. And so one of the challenges on making Christianity relevant to young people is how to take Christian theology and make it something that they can associate with, that's something that's part of who they are that lasts. It isn't just something intellectual, it isn't just something theoretical. You know, as Katie was talking about, something really clicked, something worked for what she was doing. And that had something to do with their formation, who they were. They had their personal identity invested in the issues that were brought up. They were emotionally involved. And really, this is very spiritual, because basic idea of a spiritual experience is it unites our ideas, it unites our thinking. The evaluation of the experience and the experience come together. I think Claire was talking about, what was it, an equilibrium for a quarter of a minute of Père Alphonse Catherine. That was amazing to me, how, this kind of idea. And this is kind of a monochromatic version of the diagram, where it's just you experiencing your own sense of the divine and sense of the whole. And so this kind of color version is just a greater expansion of that. And this doesn't just apply to the individual, but the community as a whole. And lastly, I wanted to simply identify this phenomenon in the canon. Dr. Bob was talking about the canonicity of the see, judge, act method. And of course that's in Catholic social teaching, Catholic hierarchy. But I also found it in 2 Corinthians. To me, there you have see, judge, act, not in so many terms, but it's all over the place. details in what's called the painful letter, the first 5 chapters of 2 Corinthians, where the spirits of the apostle are translated to the beneficial outcome of the whole community, where the death of one for all, right, is experienced as a death of all. So there's this identification with what is outside of ourselves that becomes personal. So this is part and parcel of the base of Christian teaching. But there's a slight difference, and I just want to end on that. So these are the themes, 2 Corinthians, the falsity of this world, and one dies for all, we all die. It's expanded Christ consciousness. But in terms of the lesson I think that Katie was trying to draw, that I also, just, before she even mentioned that, I was thinking about that, is that going back to the roots of Christianity, this Christ consciousness was in the context of redemptive Christ consciousness, of kind of an old person's version of the consciousness, where you die to yourself, where you have to let go. But for young people, they're raring to go and develop. They want to let go all the time. And so this incarnational version, which we can see in the Cardijn movement, is very appropriate to them, and at the same time gives them a window, gives them a frame of reference to appreciate traditional Christian doctrine. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that. When Joe was talking, I heard Stefan in my mind. Stefan, when we talk via email, he always invokes something about Cardijn. Cardijn would be smiling. Cardijn would be happy. I think Cardijn would be looking up, smiling, seeing what extraordinary gifts and talents people are bringing in their own context to the CJ Diagnostics. So I really love thanking you. Our final speaker is David Maloney. And David has worked for over 30 years as a public historian in Australia, mainly in the cultural heritage sector. He is presently a PhD candidate at the University of Divinity in Melbourne, Australia. The title of his dissertation is The YCW in Melbourne, 1960 to 1993, Formation and Transformation. So please give a warm welcome to David Maloney.
Speaking with you, especially I'm an early stage PhD student and a fledgling Cardijn activist, so I'm looking forward to any feedback and instructions I can get from you at the end. If I speak too fast, just put your hand up because you probably won't understand my Australian accent. I'll just talk a little bit about the Melbourne YCW quickly. And there's a theme here of conflict which comes that I wanted to sort of focus on towards here. The Melbourne YCW was officially founded in 1942. It's just very recently expired, but efforts are being made to revive it. By extension, worker Marilyn Bellet, also here with us today. My thesis will focus on the period that so profoundly changed the church and society and that so greatly impacted the YCW. Stephen Gigas tells us that the Melbourne YCW was per capita one of the largest in the world. Its sizable number of paid-up members was regularly replenished from a large pool of general members who participated in its services, notably its massive football and other sporting competitions, parish dances and other leisure and cultural activities. I was never a YCW member, but some 10 years ago I began to discover its formidable civic achievements. For example, it helped secure Victoria's Cooperative Housing Act, undertook land subdivision and established a city-based trading cooperative. It became Victoria's first credit union and instigated an eruption of YCW parish credit co-ops. They thought it was too good to keep all this to the Catholic Church, and in 1961 decided to establish the Cooperative Development Society to promote the industry and regional credit unions within Victoria General. And so today the very large and strong teachers, police, nurses, firefighters, credit unions are all a result of the Cana movement, the church's first marriage preparation course, which I think was common with a number of countries, a derivative of international YCW. It established hostels for post-war refugees and a city accommodation service for country youth. It had a major road safety campaign, which was instrumental in the introduction of Victoria's compulsory seatbelt legislation, the first in the world. If you want to see something about that, just Google YCW Road Safety Campaign. There's a 3-minute video clip on it, which has been prepared recently. It's very interesting. Behind such headline items were ongoing industrial campaigns on behalf of apprentices, casual workers, the unemployed, and campaigns regarding consumer credit for vulnerable people. Even more profound than such social transformation was the YCW's formation of thousands of its members through gritty everyday encounters with their peers. Just to summarise a bit, for the young worker, the solution to such a real problem had the potential, had the potential to make sense of life and the gospel, sometimes dramatically. It could liberate, bring good news, make it real, for some it led to an intoxicating commitment. The goal was to accept, gradually engage, empower and bring each person to a higher level of responsibility and consciousness. Some of you will recognise Stefan's phrase there. Each step is an advance in the unknown, and each step is an invitation to further commitment, wrote Patrick Keegan. Teilhard de Chardin lavishly depicts a similar process. Each reality attained and left behind gives us access to the discovery and pursuit of an ideal of higher spiritual content. The more nobly a man wills and acts, the more avid he becomes for great and sublime aims to pursue. He will want wider organisations to create new paths to blaze, causes to uphold, truths to discover, and ideals to cherish and defend. So, gradually, the worker no longer belongs to himself. Little by little, the great breath of the universe has insinuated itself into him through the physics of his humble but faithful action, has broadened him, raised him up, borne him on. I mentioned this progressive journey this way because it's kind of at the basis of what we're trying to do in terms of Cardijn action. Such a process was responsible for many religious vocations and a disproportionate number of adult parish leaders, and had huge influence beyond the church and the world. That was the estate in itself. 3 examples. YCW veterans played a leading role in shaping Australia's major post-conciliar ecumenical movement, Action for World Development, which marshalled 150,000 people into small groups to consider international justice issues. Also in the 1970s, 3 YCW veterans arranged a meeting to establish a free legal service for youth, which became the prototype and pioneer of Australia's now celebrated community legal service movement. A YCW veteran recently exposed double dealing with the National Catholic Aligned Trade Union and is now establishing a competing union for workers. So there's 2 variations of Catholic unions. In the early 1970s, the Melbourne YCW suffered a catastrophic collapse, falling rapidly from over 100 parish cells to about a dozen. And that took place in about 18 months, I think. We don't know why. Politics were at play in some sort of unknown government shaft. But at this stage, I'm presuming that it was primarily the result of structural changes in the workforce and tertiary education, the decline of localism, the motor car primarily, and competition from the counterculture and the new social movements. These exciting new youth developments promise perhaps immediate social change without the need for painstaking meetings in breezy parish halls. The movement revived, but in a much smaller way, from the late 1970s, with a new emphasis on its worker character. Its numerous surveys of young workers made significant contributions to Australian labour policy. Such a big history, so relevant to both the church and civil society, needs to be told. Australian scholar Father David Ransom has read the encyclicals and movements of the 20th century as the beginning of a new lay epoch in the history of the church, a turning point equivalent to those of the Desert Fathers, the monasteries, and the 19th century religious apostolic orders. So although the Cardijn movements are now a shadow of their former selves, a longer perspective would have our own stories, the memoirs of Frank Ardito, the blog of Reuben Joseph in India, Bill Drill's biographies of the Chicago Church, Mary Orien's history and the analysis of academics as documents of a pioneering moment. Regardless of Ransom's long vision, the Cardijn method is evidently relevant for a church which in the medium time is slowly becoming conscious of its need to rebuild at the grassroots. Part of the history is an undercurrent of uncertainty by some in the church and by some in the YCW about one another, a political, spiritual tension. This was understandable. There had been disputes between the movement and the bishops in the heat of the Cultural Revolution and the Vietnam War. Afterwards, the YCW fell out of favour as competitors emerged in the field of youth formation. The differences between the Australian bishops themselves suggest that the tension is more deeply seated. I think that the story of the YCW goes to the heart of Catholicism's still contested response to the modern world. A few years after Rare and Rivera confirmed that the Church was in fact officially interested in the world, the anti-modernist forces, calling themselves integralists, began to assemble and prosecute the nature-grace debate that has overshadowed and shaped our 20th century history. Is grace present in the world, not through the temporal order by creation, but only through Christ, mediated sacramentally through the Church? Yet, with Pius XI's 1935 declaration of the YCW as the perfect form of Catholic action, the YCW became the spearhead of the Church's pre-Vatican II pastoral response to the modern world. Vatican II's adoption of an inductive, life-based approach to Christianity is regularly associated with philosopher Blondel, thinkers such as Teilhard, the sociological perspectives of Maritain and Mounier, and the new theology of post-war France. But apparently independently of these intellectuals, the YCW lived and incarnated these disruptive theologies. So while the theologians were talking about it, the YCW was actually doing it. If that's the case, its history must be a rich and virtually unexplored troves of insights for the Church's pastoral and evangelical strategies. Although the Vatican Council endorsed Cardijn's insistence on the continuity between our temporal and eternal destinies, the integralists remained implacably hostile to any secularism, oppose the world, and resist any authority other than the Church. But in addition, there also appears to be a wider unease within the Church at a method of Christian formation which apparently does not privilege God, prayer and doctrine, but which instead starts with the human problem of life. For example, Cardijn Soenens termed Cardijn's method indirect evangelisation and deprecated it as humanising before Christianising. Although there was widespread support for the YCW in Australia, there was also oblique but pervasive opposition, not only among the hierarchy. After Cardijn's death, we know differences also arose within the YCW itself around the religious dimension of his less than perfectly articulated, and in Melbourne at least, incompletely understood, existential or Christian humanist theology. In response to the pluralistic nature of its international work, the 1975 IYCW conference in Linz, in Austria, focused on more universal human values, too much at the expense of its Christian character, according to the Vatican, whose later ruling tragically consolidated an international split. My thesis will thus attempt to address the reserve or the caution that exists within the Church about the Cardijn method by investigating the process of its Christian formation. Firstly, by clearly identifying the elements of the YCW method, including the significant variations that occurred over my study period. For example, the change from the centrally produced and printed social inquiry to a more democratic and informal review of life. The shift from a Christian to a worker focus, including an unsuccessful attempt to move from parishes to workplaces, the role of leadership, chaplains and autonomy. And the second thing that the thesis will attempt is to forensically investigate the application of these methods. 30 oral history interviews with former members of 3 parish cells will shed light, I hope, on whether and how the method worked in terms of Christian, human and Christian formation and social transformation. It is hoped that these answers to these questions might contribute to a revived grassroots church strategy. At present, the YCW and YCS are much reduced in Australia, but still vital and enthusiastic. Although overtly spiritual youth movements remain in favour, and the bishops have now withdrawn funding from the YCS because it is inactive in many dioceses, there are also signs that the Cardijn method is quietly but regularly being revisited as the Church searches for an effective grassroots formation and pastoral program. Firstly, since 2010, the teaching resources of all Australian bishops' annual social justice statements have included a CJJAC social inquiry to help people translate its didactic statements into practice. Also, a few weeks ago, Catholic Mission Australia announced a partnership with YCS and YCW to use the action reflection method to help sustain its social justice immersion experiences that goes on to Myanmar. And the recently invoked working document of the Vatican Synod on Young People also invokes CJJ. I'd like to conclude with 3 examples of Cardijn Community Australia Melbourne activities over the past 7 years. I should say Cardijn Community Australia is a small group, well, as I'd say, less than 20 active members, but we've got about 300 odd people on our newsletter list who are interested in supporting us, and we're involved in different things. First thing we did was we developed a Cardijn training manual for parishes with inquiries on my family, my community and my work, obviously based on Cardijn. So there's a general introduction and there's 4 inquiries on work 1, my community, the gospel reflection, CJJAC, review of life, business and some Catholic social teaching statements there to help reflection. The second things we did, which was good actually, was a Metropolitan Signs of the Times meeting. So we invited people to come along and tell us what the signs of the times were, what was happening in their world. And we were surprised to see that the things that they were most deeply concerned with were family life and poor parish life. As a result, we're developing an inquiry on family. And in conjunction with the Diocesan Social Services Agency, holding regional expos to showcase the services parishes are already providing. The next one in September will be on parishes in the Mourad Sea. So I was particularly interested in what Tony was saying about the Cincinnati work in that regard. We also joined a wider campaign to stop a $17 billion tunnel, which was going to consume all the funding for public transport for a couple of generations, and we were successful with community groups with that. So these things were very educative for us. We were working with community, we were discussing things with people, we were talking with people and including that as a survey, and the power we discovered of writing down ordinary people's experiences was quite remarkable to the people who were reading our work. The final thing we did was we used my community inquiry in my own suburban parish and generated a couple of things. One, an unsuccessful single fathers initiative, and secondly, a very successful initiative on homelessness, in which we teamed up with local community group to form another group and held a successful public meeting, saved the homes of 120 people in a cabin park. We've organised soup kitchens. We've been invited now by council to, after having made a lot of submissions, to suggest ideas for low-income and crisis housing. So that's probably as much as I've got time to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for giving us an insight into what's going on in Australia. I have a few key points before we all go out and reinvigorate ourselves with lots of caffeine and coffee. Starting to notice some of the body language, starting to lack a little energy, so coffee is our best friend this hour. A few things really quickly. I was talking with the liturgical committee at lunch, after lunch, and if anyone plays the piano in this room, I would love to meet you. during the coffee break. Any pianist trained halfway or all the way, please come see me. We can have some musicals helping you with the liturgy tomorrow. Also, this has come up, and I'm just going to make it brief. Some of you who arrived late or what have you, or international approached me with paying for your registration. Some of you still need to do that. The coffee break would be an opportune time to take care of that before we get really busy tonight. Also, a lot of people keep asking about the papers and the publication. There will be a publication, most likely 2 journals. We received so many papers that we had to, this was originally a 2-day conference, so we had to expand to 3. And since I've had about 7 people inquire as to the process, let me just be clear now. Once everyone gets back home, please email your finished draft that you would like to be published directly to my email. It's the same email that was listed on the website, that many of you have received email from me and Stefan. So we will, turn those around, send you any sort of editorial comments, and then, where's Hillary? Hillary, you'll look to publish those, later in the fall? Yeah. Okay, so that's the process and protocol for getting me the papers. And then last, before we release the coffee break, the workshops are in these classrooms. In classroom 105, Claire Adams, on the human person and the C-Judge-Act method. 106 is Marianne and Brian Thielen, as well as Laura and John Pisbiz, engaging small groups to use Observe, Judge, Act to embrace the mission of Christ. Frank Ardito will be in 113, Lessons from the Basic Elements of a YCW Meeting in the U.S. during the late 50s and 60s. I think that's going to have a Chicago slant to it. And then Teresa Mourad, Monica Beltran, Nancy Conrad will be representing Cardijn Associates, and they'll be talking on organizing with the C-Judge Act methodology, and that's in CL 115. The program has those starting at 3:30. I have 3:17. I'm going to let all those people sort of moderate what time they want to start. I'm not going to micromanage, as I have been with some of our paper presentations. But let's enjoy coffee, catch up with one another, relax, and then get back into some workshopping. Thank you very much.